Welcome back everybody. In this video, we will try to learn props and states, how they are important in developing any React applications. Props stands for properties. Basically, whenever you look into any other React applications, like whenever one component would like to pass some data to another component. So we call this as a parent component and this as a child component. You can assume, for example, this is a login component where user will be giving login credentials like username and password. Like let us assume this username and the login passwords are validated behind and in the child component where it has to render the home page of it. The particular user where he will be saying like welcome back the username. Assume this data, your username data, passed to a child component. That name has to render over here. This is called passing the data from one component to the another component. How do you do that in React? That's in properties, please. Let's try to learn about it. Let's create the same scenario here. Let's bypass the validating part of an username and the password, talking to the database and validating. Just let us pass them. Like you might be seeing here a form field here where it accepts a text box like username and the password field. Let's try to bypass this thing taking in the form now. We'll look into the forms in the next unit and how do you handle the forms, how do you take the data from the forms, we'll learn in the next unit. Let's give the data as in static. Assuming, let's try to render the same thing. Let's create my app component. We'll try to pass some data to an home component. Let us assume, let me create a component called home component.js. Um, let's create a functional component here, home. Let's try to export this one. There, default. Any functional component will return something. Let's try to return that. Now, in app.js, let me include the component which we created just now, home component. Let's try to render something here. In the h1, I am in home component. Let's try to import it. Let's look into our output. There you go. I am in home component. Now, let's pass the data over here. Props can be passed through a name, like as an attributes for any HTML element. Here, home is like acting like as an HTML element, passed like as an attributes. For example, name equals Bilahari. Let's look into that. This is how you pass the properties, like an attributes for an HTML element, right? Name and the value associated with it is Bilahari. Let's head back to home component. Like home component is passing some data here. It's responsibility of the home component to receive that. Props, short form of an properties. There. it's our turn to I am a I am props dot, or else you can give like welcome props dot, what's the object name, what's an attribute name we passed over the name. Let's look into that. If you look at here, not seeing anything. This is because you need to destructure it. This is called object destructuring. Whenever you're passing this will be passed as an object to the name equals Bilahari, will be passed as an object to the props. It's an developer responsibility to destructure it. How do you destructure it? This is how, please. This is called object destructuring. You could see that. Heading back, let me pass one more properties. College equals KMID. Here, let me write one more. Now, P tag, welcome to props dot college. There, let me pass this as in hello. You'll be seeing this one because it's written will expect you to return only one thing at a time. So just try to keep them in one fragment. Fragment is something like which is an wrapping under one thing, please. Here it's an empty element, like it's an empty fragment. It can be a division, like which you would like to use in an HTML. There you'll be using division tag, right? You can use the div as well here. Let's look into our output now. There, welcome to KMIT, right? It's in P tag. Now, the important thing here is props are read-only data. Like parent component will be passing to a child component. Child can only read it but cannot modify them. That is called as an immutability. And props are also called as an passed down to that component tree. And each component in the tree can access and use them. What does that mean? Home can pass these props received from the app.js to any other component. Similarly, let's look into that. How do you use statecom? Like props is something like communicating the data from one component to another component. But state is something which is limited to a component itself. For example, whenever you are trying to fill a form, let us head back here. Example, this is a form which is taking in registration details. Your username. User is trying to do something here. User is trying to type something. There's a button over here. User is trying to hover on it. That also called as an action over there, right? So every component within this is a registration component. Everything within that is also a component. Every component can have its own state. It is trying to take the data. It is clickable. Is it clicked or not? That is also in kind of a state of it. All these pins. And a scroll bar over here, mouse over on it or not, that is also a component. That is also a state. Every component will have its own state. It's not only to the major component over here. A component, bigger component can have the sub components in it. Every component can maintain its own state. So State is mutable, whereas props are immutable. States are mutable because, like mouse over on it, out on it, user enters something KMIT here, user may hit a backspace and type something here, NGIT. We need to handle this data. That is the reason it is mutable, immutable. State is immutable and represents the internal state of a component. It is managed by the component itself, right? And state is adhering to the a component only, please. Let's look into that. First, let us talk about a functional component. Then we'll try to look into the class component. State in functional component and in class component. Let's create a component called counter.js function counter. Let me try to export this so that I can import wherever I would like to use it. Here, let's return something. Here, let me create a state here. How do I use the state? For state, we have use state as a hook. You'll come to learn what are hooks in Unit 4. As of now, I remember that states are basically used in class components, but it is not allowed in functional component. To make it available, React team has come up with an hooks. One of the hook is useState. useState will try to return two things here in a format of an array. Const, let me say something like a count, a variable which will try to hold some data, and set count is a function which will try to handle the data of a count. What should be the initial value of the count has to be given within the useState. For example, let me give as in 0. This is a JavaScript thing. That is the reason we are not writing that in a return. We are handling that in the function. Let's try it now. Let us write here. I would like to render the value of the count. So let me use a span over here. Let me try to render the count. Count is a variable here. How do I render it then? Destructure it. We're asking JSX to take that as in JX and take the value of the count and render it here. Let's write one more here. Button. Let's click the button. What I'm trying to do here, on clicking this button called increment, it has to update the value. Let's do that. On click is an event handler. You'll be learning more on the event handler in the unit 3, please. On click, let's try to call upon one functionality which is an handling the click here. Let me call that as an increment counter. Let's try the functionality for it. Const increment counter. Let me write over here. It's an arrow function, please. It tries to call set count method, which will try to update the value. Set count, make the count value incremented by 1. Let's look into that. Let's import this into app.js. Let me comment out the props one here. Counter, import it. Let's look into our output. Use state is not defined. It's our task to import it, please. Do not forget to import it. Use state, import React, comma, use state from React. You can see that. Let me try to increment it. Do you see that? It's trying to increment. Let's do one more. Let us recreate another button. Let me write before the count. Let me call this as an decrement. It should call an decrement function to decrement the value. Let us write that one more. Since we are updating the same value here, I need not write another state, please. Decrement will try to decrement the value by 1. Let's look into that. Here, decrement the value. There you go. Increment, decrement. You please try to create one more button here, reset, that always resets the count to n0. Let's look this the same thing in our class component. Let me create a counter, one more counter, class counter .js. Let's write that. Let me import first React. The class, let me call that as an class counter. Always make sure that your file name is your component name. Extends component, please. Just import the component. Do you see the line 1? It has been imported. Now, since it is a class, it has its own constructor and it has its own props, please. So, super props, don't worry about all these things. We'll be learning soon all of this. So let's write a state, this dot state equals some value. Let me assign a value as in count key and the value initially as in 0. Since this is coming by default with a class which is not available in functional components. To make sure that states can be handled in functional components, they introduced useState hook. This is what I was talking before. Heading back to the class component. Let's write now. Let's write the render method. We'll try to render something. Return. We'll always return something. Empty fragment. Let me try to fee tag or span tag. Recreating the same thing, please. Count variable. It's always destructured. So since count is not the direct variable it is available, please use this dot state dot count. Let's have a button over here. Button increment on click. Let's call a functionality called handler. Basically it is called as an handler. Increment function, increment count. Let's write the logical part for that. Here, increment count. There. So how do you do that in a functional component? Just calling set count here. Here you just call this dot set state, which is predefinedly available, please. So what does it has to update? Count value. As you know, count I cannot access directly. This dot state dot count plus 1, and that has to be reassigned to the count one, right? I hope you are seeing that. Let's look into this. Import class component. Here let me call as an h1 or h3 functional component state handling. Here one more h3 class component state handling. Let's import class component. Class counter. It seems like I did not export it here. It is not showing up. Let me try to export it. Export default class counter. Heading back app.js, class counter. Make sure you import it. Let's see our output. Default. One sec. It's in class counter. It's a class counter. Seems I did not save this. Element type is invalid. Check the render method of app. Where's the app, please? Seems to be correct to me. Give me a sec. Have a constructor, imported component. No, I have imported them correctly. Let me save all the files. Yeah, there. Now let's increment this. Do you see that? Let's try to write the functionality for the decrement operation. Button, one more button with an decrement, please. This dot decrement uses the same. Copy this decrement count. We'll try to reduce one value. Heading back there. Oh, it seems I did forgot here. Decrement, increment, decrement. This is how you handle it, please. And this state is valid only to this component. Imagine this may have the multiple components internally. It has its own states to maintain, please. Every component can have their own states to maintain. That is all for today's session. See you in the next video, please.